Today, we dive into an emotional story about prejudice, courage, and unexpected change. It begins with the Carter family, a successful black family who booked first-class tickets for their flight to Miami. They hoped for a peaceful journey to celebrate a recent milestone, but as soon as they stepped into the first-class cabin, they were met not only with cold stares but also with the prejudiced actions of Vivian Harper, a seasoned flight attendant. This story is not just about the Carter family's fight for fairness, but also serves as a mirror reflecting the hidden biases within us. What gives a mother like Angela Carter the strength to remain calm and dignified amidst judgmental stares? And will Vivian, burdened by her own biases but standing on the brink of transformation, find a way to make amends? Join us as we uncover this gripping yet profoundly human story. It's not just a tale of confrontation, but also a journey of self-reflection and redemption. If you enjoy stories that deliver powerful emotions and meaningful lessons, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss more inspiring narratives. What do you think of the Carter family's response to injustice? What would you do if you were in Vivian's shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Flight 321 to Miami. First-class passengers are now invited to board. The announcement echoed clearly through the airport speakers. Vivian stepped into the first-class cabin, swiftly scanning each row. She felt a sense of satisfaction at the pristine cleanliness and impeccable order of the space. As the stream of passengers began boarding, Vivian quickly noticed the arrival of the Carter family. Darius Carter led the way with his wife, Angela, and their two children, Jameer, a bright-eyed boy who eagerly surveyed his surroundings, and Maya, tightly clutching a golden teddy bear. "Good morning, MS." Harper Angela greeted with a warm smile, glancing at Vivian's name tag. "We have first-class seats in 2A and 2 billion. Vivian returned a professional smile, though a subtle discomfort stirred within her. "Good morning. Please follow me," she said, guiding the family to their seats. Yet, as her eyes lingered on Maya's teddy bear and Jameer's energetic steps, she couldn't shake the feeling that this didn't quite align with the serene, refined atmosphere she envisioned for the first-class cabin. As the Carters settled into their seats, Vivian noticed some first-class passengers discreetly glancing back. The elderly Peterson couple, seated in 1A and 1 billion, exchanged subtle looks of disapproval. Mr. Peterson leaned over to whisper something to his wife, both shaking their heads faintly. Recognizing these familiar reactions, Vivian leaned toward her younger colleague Nina and whispered, "The kids might disrupt the cabin. I think we should consider rearranging their seats to avoid disturbing the other passengers." Nina hesitated before responding, "But their tickets are for 2A and 2 billion. I'm not sure we need to move them." Vivian gave her a measured look. "As flight attendants, it's our responsibility to ensure a comfortable experience for all passengers, especially in first class." Shortly afterward, Vivian returned to the Carter family. With a gentle but authoritative tone, she said, "I'm sorry to inform you, but to ensure the comfort of all passengers, I'll need to move your family to seats 4C and 4D, near the bulkhead. That area is more suitable for families with children." Angela's expression hardened slightly. "We booked these seats ahead of time, and I don't believe our children will bother anyone." Vivian maintained her smile but kept her tone firm. "This is to ensure the best experience for everyone. I hope you understand." Darius placed a reassuring hand on Angela's shoulder and nodded. "We'll move, but I trust there won't be any further issues." As the Carter family moved to their new seats, the murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Mr. Peterson leaned over to his wife and muttered, "At least they know their place nearby." Nina overheard and shifted uncomfortably. She turned to Vivian and whispered, "Do you think they might feel discriminated against?" Vivian shrugged. "I'm just doing what's best for everyone." Angela, meanwhile, maintained a calm demeanor, though her eyes betrayed her disappointment. "Mom, why did we have to move?" Jameer asked loudly, drawing glances from a few passengers. Angela gently stroked his hair and replied, "It's okay, Jameer. Let's just enjoy the flight." Darius, though silent, observed everything closely. He was no stranger to situations like this and quietly resolved that this would not be the end of it. The Carter family's journey had begun with the hope of a peaceful flight, but the moment they entered the first-class cabin, silent prejudices began to surface. This was only the start of the challenges they would face. Will they hold on to their dignity amidst judgmental stares? Don't miss the unfolding tension and share your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned for the next developments. The first-class cabin remained as serene as ever, but within the Carter family, A sense of unease had begun to creep in. Angela glanced at her two children. Jameer was trying to immerse himself in his comic book, while Maya quietly played with her teddy bear. Darius checked his watch, his expression calm, though a hint of tension flickered in his eyes. He reached for his wife's hand, offering silent reassurance that everything would be fine. Maya tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, I'm thirsty. Can I have some water?" she asked softly but with a hint of urgency. Angela nodded gently. "All right, sweetheart. Let me call for some water." Angela pressed the call button. A small light illuminated on the control panel. Minutes passed, but no one came. "Mommy, are they bringing the water?" Maya asked, her eyes now filled with concern. Angela pressed the button again. This time, Nina, the younger flight attendant, appeared promptly, her polite smile in place. "Hello, Ma'am. How can I assist you?" "My daughter is a little thirsty. Could we get a glass of water for her, please?" Angela asked softly. Nina nodded. "Of course. I'll be right back." But just as Nina turned to leave, Vivian entered the cabin with a stern expression. "Nina, I'll handle this," she said, cutting in abruptly. Then, addressing Angela, she added, "I'm sorry, but we're currently prioritizing drink service for the passengers in the front rows. It might take a while." Angela frowned slightly. "We're first-class passengers, too." Vivian's smile remained, but her tone grew colder. "I understand, Ma'am, but today we have several special passengers who need priority service." Angela held her composure, but her calm gaze betrayed her displeasure. Darius, meanwhile, noticed the tension. "Don't worry," he said quietly to his wife. "If needed, I'll get the water myself." A short while later, Jameer leaned into his mother. "Mom, I'm cold. Is there a blanket?" Angela stroked his hair to comfort him. "Let me ask them for one, okay?" She pressed the call button again, and once more Nina arrived, her courteous smile as present as ever. But before she could speak, Vivian appeared behind her, her voice firm. "I'm sorry, but we're out of blankets." Angela's surprise showed on her face. "No more blankets? But this is first class. We've flown with your airline before, and there have always been enough blankets for every passenger." Vivian crossed her arms, her voice light but sharp. "That's correct, Ma'am, but today we've handed them all out. Apologies for the inconvenience." Angela exhaled deeply. I see your words were restrained, but inside she felt insulted, not because of the missing blanket, but because of Vivian's attitude. There was something in her tone, subtle but unmistakable, that revealed an underlying bias Angela couldn't ignore. Nina stepped into the galley, where Vivian was rearranging the drink trays. "Vivian," she began hesitantly, "I think there are still a few blankets in the forward storage compartment. Can I grab one for them?" Vivian paused, her expression briefly flickering with irritation. "Nina, you're still new at this. We need to manage the first-class cabin carefully. If you cater to every little request, we'll lose control." "But they're just asking for a blanket," Nina replied softly, her voice tinged with concern. "The kids haven't done anything wrong." Vivian sighed, placing a hand on Nina's shoulder. "Learn this. Nina, the customer isn't always right. Our job is to maintain order and ensure the comfort of more important passengers." Meanwhile, Angela and Darius were doing their best to keep the mood light for their children. Maya curled into her mother's lap, while Jameer occasionally asked, "Mom, why won't they give us a blanket? We paid for first class." Angela smoothed her son's hair and said gently, "Don't worry, Jameer. Let's just enjoy the flight. Nothing's perfect." Darius stayed silent, observing everything closely, though his eyes seemed to be recording every detail. He held Angela's hand and whispered, "Don't let them ruin this for us. But if this keeps up, I'll address it." Other passengers in the first-class cabin had started to take notice. A middle-aged woman nearby whispered to her travel companion, "Something's not right. That family has been nothing but polite, and their kids are so well-behaved. There's no reason they should be treated this way." A man in seat 3A also glanced at the Carter family, his expression sympathetic. Though he said nothing, he shook his head slightly as if disapproving of the service. As the flight continued, the tension in the first-class cabin grew palpable, even though no one spoke up directly. Angela and Darius kept their composure, but both could feel the sting of unfair treatment. Vivian, while outwardly composed, couldn't ignore the quiet judgment from other passengers, though she remained convinced she was doing the right thing. Nina, however, was uneasy. Internally, she wrestled with her thoughts. Should I say something? If I stay silent, am I becoming part of the problem? Vivian's subtle prejudices began to surface more clearly with each action, making the atmosphere on board increasingly stifling. Yet the Carter family was not one to back down easily. Would their resilience prevail against this injustice? Stay tuned to see how the conflict escalates. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. The first-class cabin maintained its outward calm, but the atmosphere had grown tense and stifling. The Carter family continued to endure subtle discrimination, but it was becoming clear that other passengers were beginning to sense something was off. Angela kept her composure, but her eyes betrayed her frustration and exhaustion. Darius remained silent, yet his gaze was fixed on every unfolding detail. Vivian, meanwhile, attempted to appear unbothered, though her demeanor hinted at her own stress. Nearby, Nina stole uneasy glances at Vivian, clearly unsettled but hesitant to speak up. The tension escalated when Jameer, curious like any child, pressed the call button again. Maya whispered, "Jameer, don't press it anymore." "They're not going to come," but Jameer shook his head. "We paid for this. They have to come." Vivian, busy serving the front row, frowned as she noticed the call light illuminate once more. She strode directly to seats 4C and 4D, her tone icy as she asked, "Can I help you?" Jameer responded immediately, without hesitation. "We'd like more water. Mommy told me to ask you." Darius moved to stop him, but Jameer had already spoken. Angela placed a calming hand over her son's. Vivian exhaled sharply, her tone laced with sarcasm. "Young man, I think you've had enough water for now." She then turned to Angela, her voice carrying a thinly veiled edge. "Ma'am, while your request might be reasonable, I'd appreciate it if you could avoid pressing the call button so frequently." Angela met Vivian's gaze directly, her voice steady but firm. "I don't think asking for water for my child is unreasonable, especially since we're first-class passengers like everyone else here." The cabin fell into silence. Several passengers, including the Petersons in the front row, turned to look toward the Carters and Vivian. A middle-aged woman in seat 3 billion shook her head in quiet disapproval, her expression clearly empathetic toward the Carter family. Sensing the rising tension, head flight attendant Laura Franklin, a composed woman in her 50s, stepped in to intervene. She approached with professional grace, placing a gentle hand on Vivian's shoulder. "Vivian, I'll handle this situation." "Thank you." Reluctantly, Vivian stepped back, but not without casting a frosty glance toward Angela. Laura turned to the Carter family and offered a polite bow. "I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience. I'll bring water right away and arrange for an extra blanket if your children need one." Angela nodded, her tone calm but resolute. "Thank you. I just want to ensure my family is treated fairly." Laura offered a small, reassuring smile. "We'll do everything we can to make your flight comfortable." She quickly fetched the water and retrieved a blanket from the storage compartment, handing it to Jameer. The boy smiled brightly and said softly, "Thank you." Shortly after, a passenger named Thomas Blake, a businessman seated in 3A, unexpectedly spoke up. "Excuse me, but I think we need to address how this family has been treated since the beginning of the flight. I've been sitting here observing, and I find it unacceptable." He turned to Laura, his voice steady but firm. "They paid for first-class tickets, just like the rest of us. I think we all expect fairness here." Even Mr. Peterson, who had previously shown displeasure toward the Carter family, softened his tone and added, "We didn't mean to cause any trouble, but perhaps this has been blown out of proportion." Standing at the back of the cabin, Vivian's face darkened as she overheard these remarks. She felt threatened but chose to remain silent. After things calmed down momentarily, Laura returned to the galley, where Vivian stood with her arms crossed, her expression rigid with frustration. "Vivian," Laura began, her tone firm yet calm, "I need to understand what's going on. It's clear the passengers are upset, and I've noticed inconsistencies in how you've been serving them." Vivian responded immediately. "Laura, I'm only doing what I believe is best for everyone. That family, they're making the atmosphere uncomfortable." Laura folded her arms. "Have they done anything wrong? They've been polite, and their requests have been reasonable. I need you to tell me the real reason." Vivian didn't respond, her gaze shifting elsewhere. Laura sighed and placed a hand on her shoulder. "If you can't explain yourself, I have no choice. I'll need to report this to the captain." Returning to the private crew area, Laura picked up the intercom phone and dialed the cockpit. "Captain Hayes, I need to discuss an issue in the first-class cabin," she said, striving to maintain a calm tone. Captain Hayes's voice came through the line, steady and professional. Laura, what's going on? Tell me. There's a problem with how a family is being served. I believe it's starting to affect the overall atmosphere of the flight, Laura replied. I need your input or intervention before this escalates further. Understood, Hayes said firmly. Arrange a time for us to meet. I'll assess the situation. Laura set the phone down, feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on her. She knew this was no longer a minor issue, and that the situation could escalate into something far more serious. The injustice on the flight had now reached Captain Hayes's attention, but could he resolve the situation before it spiraled out of control? The truth was beginning to surface, putting everyone in an unforeseen predicament. The story is about to take a dramatic turn. What do you think Captain Hayes will do? Share your thoughts and stay tuned for the next developments. Captain Hayes, a man in his early 50s with a calm yet commanding demeanor, stepped out of the cockpit and quickly met with head flight attendant Laura in the galley. Laura, her face tense, began briefing him on the situation. Captain Hayes, I've received several complaints from passengers, particularly about how the Carter family in seats 4C and 4D has been treated, Laura said, in a low voice to avoid being overheard. Vivian's actions and attitude have been unacceptable, but I haven't been able to intervene further without risking disruption to the flight. Hayes nodded, his sharp eyes assessing the gravity of the situation while his voice remained steady. Have they caused any disturbances? Is there any valid reason they're being treated differently? Laura shook her head. Not at all. They've been very polite, only asking for water and a blanket for their children. But Vivian seems to be deliberately delaying service and has shown them clear disrespect. Hayes frowned, his dissatisfaction evident. I need to observe this myself. We cannot let this escalate further. Hayes decided to take a vacant seat behind the Carter family, positioning himself to observe without drawing attention. He maintained an unassuming demeanor, appearing as just another passenger. Darius and Angela didn't notice the captain's presence, while Vivian briefly glanced at him but didn't suspect he was monitoring her. Maya sat drowsily in Angela's lap, while Jameer, though quiet, appeared visibly uncomfortable. Darius rested his hand on Angela's, offering silent reassurance. Before long, a small yet tense situation arose. Angela pressed the call button again, this time to request a napkin after Maya accidentally spilled some water on her dress. Vivian arrived promptly, but her tone was laced with irritation. What do you need this time, she asked, her cold gaze fixed on Angela. Angela took a deep breath, keeping her composure. I just need a few napkins for my daughter. I don't think that's too much to ask. Vivian raised an eyebrow, her tone dripping with sarcasm. I'm just wondering why every request from you seems to require priority service. We have other passengers to attend to, you know. Darius looked up, his voice calm yet firm. I think you need to reconsider your tone. We've done nothing wrong, and we've paid the same as every other passenger here. Vivian opened her mouth to respond, but Captain Hayes stood abruptly. That's enough, Vivian. I'll handle this, he said, his authoritative voice cutting through the tension and leaving Vivian momentarily stunned. Hayes approached the Carter family, offering a slight bow as an apology. I'm Captain Hayes. I've been observing the situation, and I want to personally apologize for what your family has endured on this flight. Angela and Darius looked at him in surprise. Angela asked, her voice tinged with suspicion, how long have you been here? Long enough to see that you haven't been treated fairly, Hayes replied honestly. He turned to Vivian, his expression firm. Vivian, I need to have a word with you immediately. But first, I want the Carter family to be served properly and treated with the respect they deserve. Vivian, though clearly flustered, tried to maintain a professional demeanor. I was just doing what I thought was best for the other passengers, Captain. Hayes didn't let her continue. We'll discuss this later. Laura, please make sure all of the Carter family's requests are met. Laura nodded immediately and began instructing the other flight attendants to attend to the Carters. Once the situation settled, Hayes returned to the seat near the Carter family and started a conversation. Forgive me, but I get the feeling your family isn't just any ordinary passengers, he said. Part question, part observation. Darius offered a small, sharp smile. We didn't want to make it known, as we were hoping this trip would simply be like any other passenger's experience. Angela added calmly, but it seems that wasn't possible. We travel frequently, And this time we chose American Skies to evaluate the quality of service. Hayes raised his eyebrows, momentarily surprised, though his professionalism never wavered. Evaluate the quality of service. Darius nodded. I'm the CEO of one of the major financial organizations that invests in this airline. This trip is part of an internal review. A heavy silence fell over the cabin. Darius locked eyes with Hayes, his voice steady and pointed. And I think you now understand the most significant issue your airline needs to address. Hayes took a deep breath, fully aware the situation had escalated far beyond its initial scope. He replied with determination in his voice, I assure you, we will address this. Your family will receive the response it deserves. As Hayes returned to the cockpit, he knew this flight was no ordinary journey. What he had witnessed would fundamentally change how he managed his crew. Meanwhile, Vivian, noticing the shift in the attitudes of the other passengers, began to feel the weight of mounting pressure. Angela and Darius turned their attention back to their children, attempting to enjoy the remainder of the flight. But both knew the real storm was yet to come. With the Carter family's true identity revealed, everyone on board realized this was no mere personal grievance. Could the airline repair its mistake and regain the Carters' trust? Don't miss what's next, where major changes are set to unfold. Let us know your thoughts on how the airline handled this situation. After his brief conversation with the Carter family, Captain Hayes returned to the cockpit, but his mind was far from at ease. Meanwhile, the murmurs in the first-class cabin were growing louder and harder to ignore. Some passengers, including the Petersons, were no longer subtle in their opinions. Mrs. Peterson turned to her husband, speaking loud enough for others to hear. I knew something wasn't right from the beginning. Look at this, they paid for first-class tickets and have to endure this? It's disgraceful. In seat 3A, Thomas Blake, the businessman who had spoken up earlier, addressed Laura as she passed by. I hope your airline doesn't think this is something that will just be brushed under the rug. I'll be documenting this issue when we land. Laura nodded nervously, trying to manage the rising tension, but it was clear the situation was spiraling out of control. Vivian, standing in a corner of the galley, felt the weight of judgmental stares from both passengers and colleagues. Her pride only deepened her frustration and made her feel more out of control. Sensing the mounting scrutiny on his family, Darius decided it was time to act. He took out his phone and quickly sent a message to a contact. Angela watched him, understanding without asking what he was doing. Who did you just message? Angela asked quietly, keeping her voice calm. Darius gave her a small, knowing smile. Senior management. They need to know what's happening before this escalates further. Angela sighed deeply. I get it. But I hate that we always have to use our influence just to demand the basics. Sometimes, Darius replied, his tone sharp. Power isn't what we want, it's what they force us to use. Shortly after Vivian decided to reassert her control, she marched to the Carter family, her expression rigid with defiance. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, she began, her tone seemingly polite but dripping with condescension. I believe your repeated requests are making some of the other passengers uncomfortable. Darius rose from his seat, tall and imposing. Really? Because I thought your job was to ensure all passengers are comfortable, not just the ones you prefer. Vivian hesitated, but quickly tried to defend herself. I don't think you understand. I'm simply doing my job. Angela also stood, her eyes resolute and free of patience. If this is your job, you're doing it terribly. We haven't asked for anything beyond what we've paid for. If you can't handle that, maybe someone else should be doing your job. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and passengers began standing up to observe the exchange. Sensing the escalation, Laura quickly intervened, placing a firm hand on Vivian's shoulder. All right, that's enough. Vivian, I think you need to step away for a moment. Vivian turned to Laura, her eyes blazing with resentment. Why am I always the one at fault? I'm just trying to maintain order and ensure first class remains what it's supposed to be. Laura sighed, her voice measured but firm. Vivian, we'll talk about this later. For now, let me handle it. Captain Hayes, having fully grasped the situation from Laura's reports, decided to leave the cockpit and return to the first-class cabin. As he stepped in, the entire cabin fell silent. His authoritative presence commanded attention as his gaze swept over the passengers before settling on Vivian. Vivian, he said, his voice low but firm, meet me in the galley immediately. Vivian, though reluctant, followed him out of first class. In their brief exchange, Hayes made no effort to hide his displeasure. "Do you realize that your behavior has crossed the line?" he asked bluntly. Vivian began to defend herself. "I was only doing what I thought was best to protect the experience of other passengers," Hayes interrupted her. "Whose experience were you protecting? The ones you deemed suitable? This is not how we operate. Be aware that I will be reporting this directly to senior management." Vivian said nothing further, but her defeated expression spoke volumes. When Hayes returned to the first-class cabin, he approached the Carter family to formally apologize. Standing before Angela and Darius, he gave a slight bow. "On behalf of the airline, I offer my sincerest apologies for the unacceptable experience your family has endured on this flight. We will ensure this matter is addressed thoroughly." Darius regarded Hayes for a moment before nodding. "I appreciate your intervention, but there's something you should know." Hayes waited, his posture attentive. Darius continued, his tone losing the earlier calmness. "I'm Darius Carter, vice president of one of the largest investment funds in the United States. My firm holds a 20% stake in this airline. I'm here to assess the quality of service." The atmosphere in the first-class cabin froze. One by one, the other passengers realized they were witnessing something far beyond an ordinary flight dispute. Hayes, though maintaining his composure, clearly felt the gravity of Darius's words. Angela added, her voice steady but cutting, "We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for fairness. And if this is how your airline treats its customers, I trust you understand that this issue won't end when this flight lands." After Captain Hayes returned to the cockpit, the first-class cabin fell into a heavy silence. The passengers, though not speaking further, clearly shared the sense that they had just witnessed something unprecedented. Vivian stood in the galley, her gaze blank. She no longer had the energy to argue, yet she still refused to fully accept that she was in the wrong. Angela and Darius continued to care for their children, trying to normalize the situation. Maya, oblivious to the tension surrounding her, happily clung to her teddy bear. Meanwhile, Jameer sat quietly, looking at his mother with a questioning expression, as if to ask what just happened. Angela gently stroked his hair, whispering, "It's okay, sweetheart. We'll be fine." In the cockpit, Captain Hayes received a direct call from the airline's senior management, a rare occurrence mid-flight, highlighting the severity of the situation. "Captain Hayes, we've just received a report from Mr. Darius Carter," came the tense voice on the other end of the line. "He's not just a passenger, he's a major stakeholder in the airline. Can you provide details on the incident?" Hayes sighed, maintaining his calm tone. "The situation has been temporarily managed. I personally intervened and apologized to the Carter family. However, the behavior of Vivian Harper, one of our flight attendants, caused significant dissatisfaction. I'll submit a detailed report upon landing." There was a brief silence before the response came. "Ensure there are no further incidents. After landing, we need to meet with the Carter family immediately." Hayes hung up, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He knew this issue didn't just affect the flight, it had the potential to become a major crisis for the airline. Back in the first-class cabin, passengers began making their disapproval of Vivian more overt. A woman in seat 3 billion quietly said to her companion, "I've never seen a flight attendant behave like that. It's completely unacceptable." Thomas Blake, the businessman in 3A, added his voice. "I hope this airline understands that if they don't address this, they'll lose a lot of loyal customers." Vivian heard every word but remained silent. Her pride had been deeply wounded, yet her stubbornness and anger kept her from acknowledging her mistakes. In the galley, Laura, the lead flight attendant, pulled Vivian aside for a private conversation. "Vivian, do you realize the gravity of this situation?" Laura asked, her tone firm yet laced with disappointment. Vivian crossed her arms, trying to maintain her composure. "I was just doing my job. If that family feels offended, it's not my fault." Laura sighed deeply. "Vivian, you can't keep blaming others. Your behavior hasn't just impacted the Carter family, it's damaging the airline's reputation. You're losing the trust of our passengers, and that's unacceptable." Vivian glared at Laura, her expression a mix of anger and hurt. "I've worked here for over 20 years. I don't need anyone telling me how to do my job." Laura nodded, her tone softening but still firm. "I understand your years of service, but today you crossed the line. After we land, I'll have to report this, and I think you know what that means." Vivian said nothing, the weight of Laura's words settling over her. Deep down, she knew her career was now hanging by a thread. Meanwhile, Darius received a response from his company's senior leadership. He turned to Angela and said, "They want to meet us as soon as we land. I think it's time we stop staying silent." Angela nodded, her gaze steady but sharp. "I agree. We can't let this happen to anyone else." Darius leaned down and spoke to Jameer and Maya. "We'll be there soon, kids. Just a little more patience." Jameer, though not fully understanding, nodded. "You and Mom are going to handle this, right?" Angela smiled, taking her son's hand. "That's right. We'll handle it." As the plane prepared for landing, Hayes knew he needed to act decisively to prevent the situation from spiraling further. He called Laura into the cockpit for a quick discussion. "Laura, I've received directives from senior management. The Carter family will meet with leadership immediately after landing, and I need you to prepare everything to welcome them appropriately." Laura nodded. "What about Vivian?" Hayes' voice was firm. "She'll be suspended as soon as we land. But I want this handled professionally. No other passengers should notice until we've disembarked." When the plane touched down at Miami International Airport, all passengers were asked to remain seated. Captain Hayes personally approached the Carter family, bowing slightly as he spoke. "I've arranged for a meeting with our airline's leadership in the VIP lounge. I hope you'll give us the chance to make this right." Darius looked at Angela before nodding. "We'll wait. But remember, we're not just looking for an apology. We're demanding change," Hayes replied, his tone resolute. "I understand." With media and public attention mounting, the airline found itself facing a significant crisis. Vivian was suspended, the Carter family took a stand for systemic change, and hidden flaws within the airline's operations began to surface. But would this be enough to end the cycle of injustice? Stay tuned for the next chapter to see how this challenge is addressed. And don't forget to share your thoughts below. In the VIP lounge at Miami Airport, the warm lighting did little to ease the tension in the air. The Carter family was seated at a large table, awaiting the arrival of American Sky's senior leadership. Angela sat upright, her hands resting on her lap, her expression calm but resolute. Darius leaned against his chair, his demeanor cool but resolute. Maya and Jameer had been escorted to the children's play area nearby, shielded from the tense discussions to come. Captain Hayes, lead flight attendant Laura, and several senior airline representatives entered the room promptly. Leading the group was Evan Green, the airline's vice president of customer relations. A middle-aged man with polished manners, Green exuded professionalism but was clearly uneasy about the situation. Taking a seat across from the Carters, Green began with a practiced smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, on behalf of American Skies, I'd like to extend our deepest apologies for the unacceptable experience your family endured on today's flight." Angela nodded slightly, maintaining her poise, but remained silent. Darius spoke first, his tone sharp. "An apology is necessary, but it's far from sufficient. I'm not just a passenger, I'm a major stakeholder in this airline. What I witnessed today isn't just a personal grievance. It's a symptom of a systemic issue." Green hesitated for a moment, then replied carefully, "Mr. Carter, we take your concerns very seriously. I assure you that immediate measures will be taken to address this incident." Angela interjected, her tone steady but pointed. "This isn't just about an isolated incident. It's about attitude. A system that allows employees to discriminate unchecked needs to be overhauled at its core." As the discussion continued, Laura entered the room with Vivian, who had been summoned to the VIP lounge. Vivian walked in, visibly tense, trying to maintain her composure. She didn't take a seat, instead standing near the door, waiting for instructions. Green turned to address Vivian. "Ms. Vivian Harper, we've been briefed on the incident during the flight. Do you have anything you'd like to say before we make our decision?" Vivian took a deep breath, steadying her voice. "I don't believe I did anything wrong. I acted in the way I thought was best to ensure the experience of all passengers." Darius let out a dry laugh, his voice low but cutting. "You believe refusing water and blankets for children is how you ensure everyone's experience?" Vivian turned to Darius, trying to keep her tone polite. "I didn't intend to discriminate, but I believe there are priorities that need to be upheld in first class." Angela narrowed her eyes, her gaze piercing. "Priorities? Are you saying people like us don't make it onto your list of priorities?" Darius, unwilling to waste more time, stood and reached into his bag, pulling out a document. He placed it on the table in front of Evan Green. This is a preliminary report prepared by my team on American Sky's customer experience. Let me be clear, Vivian Harper is not the root of the problem, she's a symptom. Evan opened the file, skimming through a few pages. His expression shifted from confusion to seriousness. Darius continued, your training programs, workplace culture, and employee evaluation systems are fostering behaviors like this. Ms. Harper may believe she was right, but that's because the airline hasn't taught her otherwise. Captain Hayes nodded in agreement. I have to admit, what I witnessed today was unacceptable. Without meaningful reform, we'll lose the trust of our customers. After a moment of silence, Evan Green looked up, meeting the Carters' gaze directly. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, I assure you that this issue will be addressed thoroughly. Ms. Vivian Harper will be suspended immediately, and we will initiate an internal investigation to identify gaps in our training and management processes. Vivian's eyes widened in disbelief. I've worked here for over 20 years, and now I'm being suspended over one incident. Evan turned to her, his tone firm. Ms. Harper, this isn't just one incident. It's a glaring example of what we cannot tolerate within our system. Angela, while satisfied with the decision, maintained her calm demeanor. Suspending her is a start, but we'll be watching closely to ensure the airline follows through on its commitment to reform. As the meeting concluded, the Carter family left the VIP room. Angela took Darius's hand and whispered, Do you think they'll follow through? Darius gave her a small smile. They don't have a choice, but we'll make sure they stay accountable. Meanwhile, Vivian remained seated in the room, feeling as though her world had collapsed around her. Laura placed a comforting hand on her shoulder but said nothing. Vivian understood that her career was no longer in her control. Evan Green turned to Laura and Hayes, his tone grave. Prepare for a media crisis. I'm certain this won't end here. The morning after the flight and the private meeting, the story had already gone viral. Several first-class passengers, including Thomas Blake, the businessman from seat 3A, had taken to social media to share their accounts using hashtags like Justice in First Class, Amerikanski's Bias, Stand with the Carters. Thomas Blake's post quickly gained traction, garnering tens of thousands of likes, shares, and comments within hours. Major media outlets picked up the story with headlines such as, Black family faces discrimination in first class, is premium service only for a select few. Airline accused of bias by major shareholder after first-class incident. At American Sky's headquarters, senior executives faced unprecedented pressure. A crisis meeting was called, attended by Vice President Evan Green, Captain Hayes, and the airline's crisis management team. We need immediate action, Evan said, his hand glued to his buzzing phone, filled with messages from reporters. If we don't act, we'll lose both our customers and our investors. Rebecca Carter, the airline's director of communications, responded, suspending Vivian Harper was the first step, but it's not enough. We need a public statement and a comprehensive plan to address systemic issues. And what about the Carter family? Another team member asked. They're not just victims here. Darius Carter is a major stakeholder with considerable influence. We've invited them to a meeting next week, Evan replied. But convincing him won't be easy. Meanwhile, across town, Vivian Harper sat in her small apartment, her phone buzzing incessantly. Calls from friends, coworkers, and even strangers flooded in after her name surfaced on social media. An anonymous post on a prominent forum had revealed her identity, accompanied by the description flight attendant Vivian Harper, accused of discriminatory behavior in first class. Vivian read the comments, each one hitting her harder than the last. She should be fired immediately. Disgraceful behavior from someone in customer service. This is why I don't trust big airlines. She turned off her phone, overwhelmed. What she had once considered just doing her job had now become an unbearable weight. At a hotel in Miami, Darius and Angela Carter deliberated over their next steps. Darius reviewed emails from his legal team, some advising them to pursue the matter in court as a civil rights case. Angela sipped her coffee and looked at her husband. How far do you think we should take this? She asked. Darius leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful but resolute. As far as it takes, he said. This isn't just about us, it's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Darius reflected quietly. If we stop now, they'll issue a few statements, suspend one employee, and then everything will go back to the way it was. I don't want this to be forgotten. Angela nodded. But we also have to think about the impact on the kids. They don't need to see us dragged into a media frenzy forever. Darius smiled softly. I understand. But maybe we can redirect this story, turn it into an opportunity for real change. Angela raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? We'll propose a plan to the airline, Darius explained. They need to reform their training processes and we'll oversee it. Unable to bear the pressure any longer, Vivian decided to reach out to Laura, the lead flight attendant who had tried to help her during the flight. The call was hesitant. Vivian began, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. I need to talk. I can't handle this anymore. Laura sighed on the other end. Vivian, I know you're going through a tough time, but you need to face the reality that what you did crossed the line. I didn't mean to, Vivian said, her voice breaking. I was just trying to maintain order in the cabin. I didn't think it would escalate this far. Laura paused before replying. If you truly want to make things right, Vivian, you need to own up to your mistakes. Not just to the airline, but to the Carter family. But if I do that, my career will be over, Vivian replied, her tone almost desperate. Laura's voice softened but remained firm. Maybe this isn't just about your career, Vivian. Maybe it's about the person you want to be. After the emergency meeting, American Skies issued an official statement across all media platforms. We deeply apologize to the Carter family and all our customers for the unfortunate incident on Flight 321. We are committed to conducting a thorough investigation and overhauling our employee training processes to ensure every passenger receives fair and professional service. The statement garnered significant public attention, but reactions were mixed. Many criticized it as performative, arguing it failed to address the root of the problem. In her apartment, Vivian sat alone, staring at a draft of an apology letter she had been writing. It expressed remorse, but she hadn't yet found the courage to send it. Meanwhile, Angela and Darius began formulating a concrete plan to work with the airline, not just to seek justice for their family, but to ensure no other passengers would endure a similar experience. A few days after the incident, the Carter family was invited to the headquarters of American Skies to meet with senior leadership. The meeting took place in a spacious conference room with a glass table and leather chairs. Seated on the opposite side were Evan Green, Vice President of Customer Relations, Rebecca Carter, Director of Communications, and the CEO, Daniel Whitman, a man in his 60s with a contemplative but resolute demeanor. Angela and Darius entered the room, their faces composed but their eyes reflecting determination. After brief pleasantries, Daniel Whitman began the discussion. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, first and foremost, on behalf of American Skies, I want to extend our sincerest apologies. We are fully aware that what occurred on Flight 321 was unacceptable. Angela responded calmly, her tone measured. We've heard apologies before. The question is, what will you do to ensure this doesn't happen again? Daniel took a deep breath and nodded. We've drafted a comprehensive action plan to address the systemic issues within our airline, including a mandatory training program on bias awareness and customer service skills for all employees, establishing an independent internal oversight committee to handle discrimination complaints, publishing periodic progress reports on our reform efforts to rebuild customer trust. Angela exchanged a glance with Darius before turning back to Daniel. These are a good start, but we need to ensure they aren't just promises. We want to be involved in overseeing this reform and ensuring it's implemented seriously. Evan Green spoke up. We'd be more than willing to collaborate. If you agree, we'd like to invite Mr. Carter to join the Oversight Committee. Darius nodded slightly. I'll participate, but only if the changes are transparent and measurable. As the discussion continued, Laura, the lead flight attendant, appeared at the door alongside Vivian Harper. Daniel gestured for them to enter. Vivian, visibly tense, walked toward the Carter family with her hands clenched tightly. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, she began, her voice trembling, I want to say how deeply sorry I am for what happened. I behaved wrongly on that flight. There's no excuse for my actions. I allowed my biases to influence how I did my job, and that is shameful. Angela and Darius remained silent, listening intently. Angela fixed her gaze on Vivian, her expression unreadable. Are you saying this because you're genuinely remorseful, or because of public pressure? She asked, her tone calm but piercing. Vivian took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. I can't say I'm unaffected by the pressure, but I've thought about this a lot, and I realize my actions were wrong. I want to change not just to save my career, but to become a better person. Darius nodded slightly, his expression still firm. Making amends isn't just about words. It requires action. Are you willing to work to correct your mistakes? Vivian responded immediately, I'm willing. After Vivian left the room, Angela turned to Daniel Whitman. Her transformation, if it happens, will be a true test of your plan. We want to see that people like Vivian aren't just disciplined but also guided to do better. Daniel nodded. We'll monitor this closely. I assure you, this is the beginning of a new chapter for American Skies. Angela finally offered a faint smile. We don't want anyone else to go through what our family did. If you keep your promises, we're willing to cooperate. Following the meeting, Vivian was enrolled in a mandatory bias awareness training program as a condition for keeping her job. She also volunteered for community outreach activities to learn more about diversity and the impact of biases in everyday life. During one of the training sessions, Vivian stood before a group of new employees and shared her story. I made a big mistake. I'm not proud of it, but I want to use my experience to help you avoid making the same ones. Nina, Vivian's younger colleague, sat in the back of the room, smiling to herself. She's really changing, Nina thought. As for the Carter family, they returned to their daily lives but with a new mission. Darius actively participated in American Skies Oversight Committee, helping the airline improve its processes and create a fairer work environment. Angela continued her professional work, but also began writing about her family's experience as a lesson for others. Her first article, published in a prominent magazine, was titled "Equality Isn't a Privilege, Our Story." A year later, at a diversity and inclusion conference, Vivian, now a trainer, stood on stage sharing her story with a gentle smile. In the audience, Angela and Darius watched quietly, proud of the changes they had helped initiate. No one is perfect, Vivian concluded her speech. But we can all become better. And that starts by facing ourselves. The session ended with applause. Angela turned to Darius, squeezing his hand. Maybe we did the right thing after all. Not just the right thing, Darius replied with a smile. We made a difference. The story closes with a powerful message of change and redemption. Not only did Vivian face her shortcomings, but American Skies also confronted its systemic flaws, committing to a better future. The Carter family, from being victims of bias, became catalysts for reform, not just for themselves but for countless others. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to follow and support the channel so we can continue sharing impactful and meaningful stories. Your encouragement is our greatest motivation to bring valuable lessons and human stories to life. What do you think about the Carter family's journey and Vivian's transformation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, change always begins with the courage to face ourselves, but it has the power to transform the world. Thank you for being part of this story.